But God sees it all, and He knows when someone has taken His gift, you treated it with dishonor. So one of the ways He begins to deal with them is simple. He steps back and lets them feel the weight of what they had by taking it away. Slowly, gently, and sometimes without announcement, He removes your presence from their life. Not in cruelty, but in correction. Because what they never appreciated, they must now learn to miss. At first, they don't notice. Life goes on, they stay busy. But as time passes, something shifts. The people they're around don't have your spirit. The conversations don't carry your depth. The support they receive lacks the sincerity you always offered. They try to replicate your role with others, but no one fits the mold. Because you weren't just a person in their life. You were an assignment, a blessing, a divine covering that they never recognized until it was no longer there. One of the most overlooked signs that God is dealing with someone who hurt you is not found in what happens to them externally. It's what begins to shift internally when they realize what they lost. Sometimes the heaviest judgment isn't losing a job, influence, or relationships. It's the ache that comes when God allows them to finally feel the absence of your presence. Not just your physical presence, but your spirit, your kindness, your prayers, your consistency. When someone has hurt you, ignored your value, or treated your presence as disposable, it often stems from arrogance or blindness. They may have believed you would always be there, that no matter what they did, you'd forgive, return, tolerate, and keep giving. They mistook your strength for obligation, your grace for weakness, your silence for permission. And in that false confidence, they mishandled what was sacred. It's a divine contrast. God allows both harvests to come forth, sometimes side by side, not to embarrass anyone, not to expose them publicly, but to make it unmistakably clear. His justice is real, and not just for the one who did wrong, but for the one who stayed faithful, for the one who endured, for the one who trusted Him when it hurt the most. So when you see someone start to experience the unraveling of things they once built on pride, deception, or manipulation, you don't have to gloat. You don't have to say, "I told you so." You can stand still, quietly aware that what's happening is not about karma, but about kingdom justice. It's God reminding everyone that every seed matters. Every action has weight. And eventually, we all sit in the harvest of our choices. And while they're learning that truth in a hard way, you're learning it in a healing way. You didn't sow bitterness, you sowed surrender. And when it does, it's sobering. The doors they once forced open begin to close. The relationships they manipulated start to collapse. The lies they told catch up to them in ways they didn't expect. And what seemed like blessings begin to feel like burdens. What look like wins start to feel hollow. They start to experience the weight of the same pain they dished out, just in different forms. They lose the peace they once mocked. The control they once had slips through their fingers. But here's what makes it all the more powerful. While they're reaping what they sowed, you are reaping too, but from different seeds. The tears you sowed in silence, the prayers you sowed in your pain, the forgiveness you sowed when you could have sought revenge, the faithfulness you showed when you didn't understand the why. God turns all of that into a different kind of harvest, one filled with peace, with open doors, with purpose, with wisdom, with strength. You might ask yourself, why does it look like they're being rewarded for hurting me? But the truth is, God doesn't operate on appearances or emotions. He operates on truth and time. The principle of sowing and reaping is not just a biblical law, it's a spiritual guarantee. God is not mocked, Scripture says. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And it's not always immediate. Sometimes the seeds take a season to grow. Sometimes the consequences show up long after they thought they got away with it. But they always come. Because God is never blind to injustice. He is never passive about harm. He doesn't sleep on righteousness. He lets people walk for a while, sometimes to give them space to repent, sometimes to let the full picture play out. But eventually, the harvest comes. There comes a time when someone who has hurt you, lied on you, used you, or betrayed your trust begins to walk into a season where the very things they planted, intentionally or carelessly, begin to rise up around them. And no matter how it looks from the outside, one of the most sobering and unmistakable signs that God is dealing with them is this. They begin to reap what they sowed, not because God is cruel, not because he delights in pain, but because he is just. And justice, in God's timing, is never about revenge. It's about righteous correction. When a person sows seeds of discord, betrayal, manipulation, or pride, they may not see the results immediately. In fact, sometimes it looks like they're thriving right after doing wrong. They may seem happy. They might gain attention, influence, money, or connections. And that can be confusing if you were the one who was hurt, because peace doesn't come from pretending you did nothing wrong. Peace doesn't grow in denial. Real peace comes from facing what's real, asking for forgiveness, and allowing God to heal you from the inside out. Until that happens, there will be no rest. No matter how beautiful their life looks on the outside, it will always feel incomplete on the inside. And while they're in that storm of unrest, God is gently anchoring you. You're not chasing false peace. You've found the real kind. The kind that comes from release, from forgiveness, from letting go and letting God fight your battles. That's why your peace is growing and theirs is fading. That's why your soul is resting and theirs is stirring. Because God is just. And when he begins to deal with those who hurt you, the first thing he touches is their illusion of peace, so he can replace it with real transformation. He doesn't forget the weight of what they did, and he doesn't allow lasting peace to sit in the heart of someone who caused chaos in another's. Not until they repent, not until they humble themselves, not until they face what they've ignored. You may never see this happen outwardly. They may never admit it. But behind the scenes, the peace they once boasted about becomes a pursuit they can't find. Their inner life begins to fray. Some feel it as anxiety. Some feel it as restlessness. Others feel it in the form of spiritual dryness, like nothing satisfies anymore. And what's really happening is God is removing the scaffolding they built their false comfort on. He's taking away the lies they used to justify their actions. He's tugging at their soul, reminding them of what they did, not to shame them, but to awaken them. It was distraction. It was numbing. And while that works for a little while, eventually God allows it to run out. That's when the inner war begins. They try to recreate the same feeling of freedom they once had, but it doesn't land the same. The music sounds hollow. The conversations feel repetitive. The things that once gave them a sense of control or excitement now feel shallow. Their peace had conditions. It was built on not having to look in the mirror. But God always finds a way to bring the mirror back around. And here's where the reversal begins. While you are finally breathing again, they are searching for air. While your sleep is returned, theirs is interrupted. While your heart feels lighter, theirs begins to grow heavy. Not because you wished it on them, not because you prayed for their pain, but because God is righteous. When someone has hurt you and walks away as if nothing happened, it can be one of the most painful parts of the process. Watching them live like they're untouched, unbothered, and maybe even thriving. It can feel like they moved on so quickly, while you were left to pick up the broken pieces. But one of the clearest signs that God is dealing with them is when the peace they once pretended to have starts to fall apart. Because true peace doesn't come from avoiding consequences. It comes from confronting the truth. And when someone has deeply wounded another soul, especially one that belongs to God, He doesn't let them rest in denial forever. At first, they may appear content. They may smile for the camera, travel, post, party, start something new. But what no one sees is what they feel when the noise stops, when the room empties, when it's just them in silence. Don't mistake their silence for peace. Don't assume their absence is about you. Sometimes it's just the reality of a soul in process, a soul that's being dealt with. And in that place of isolation, God does the most intimate work. He breaks, He mends, He rebuilds, but only after disconnecting them from what enabled their behavior in the first place. So if someone who hurt you seems to be pulling away, don't chase after them. Let them go. Sometimes separation is sacred. Sometimes distance is divine. And while they sit in that space God has carved out for their correction, you keep moving forward, knowing that isolation in God's hands isn't abandonment. It's preparation. And here's where it gets real. While they are feeling isolated, you're beginning to connect again. You're meeting new people, you're building, you're finding community, you're feeling peace. That's not luck. That's the evidence of two very different spiritual seasons. You are being elevated. They are being confronted. You're surrounded. They're stripped. And it's not because you're better, it's because you surrendered. God knows how to put people in a position where they finally stop running. And often that happens in the wilderness. It happens in the quiet. It happens when the applause fades and the faces disappear and they're left with themselves and God. That's the place where correction begins. That's where pride dies. That's where the heart softens. The relationships that used to shield them from self-awareness start to crumble. That's not rejection. It's divine interruption. God is not punishing them. He's positioning them. He's drawing them into a space where they have no one left to impress and nowhere left to hide. You see, we often think of isolation as a negative thing. But when God isolates, He does it to confront. He puts a person in a season where they are forced to listen, not to others, not to opinions, but to the truth. And that truth often starts with a mirror. The silence becomes loud. The stillness becomes weighty. And the loneliness isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. Because when God loves someone, He doesn't just let them keep hurting others and walking away untouched. He steps in. He lets their connections dry up. He lets their charm lose its effect. He allows them to be alone, not to destroy them, but to humble them. When someone deliberately hurts you, whether by betrayal, deception, manipulation, or abandonment, one of the signs that God is beginning to deal with them is isolation. Not necessarily the kind you see right away, and not always physical isolation, but something deeper. It begins with a slow unraveling of connections. The people they once confided in don't feel as close. The circle they were so proud to be part of suddenly doesn't feel as secure. Their name, which used to carry influence in a room, begins to echo differently. And they may not realize it at first, but they're being pulled away. Not by circumstance, but by the hand of God. Because sometimes the only way God can correct a person is to first disconnect them. He removes the noise, the distractions, the audience they used to perform for. He begins to break the systems they used to protect their ego. The conversations that used to validate them now feel shallow. You've moved forward, and now the unrest is shifted from your shoulders to theirs, not out of vengeance, but out of divine order. Because when God deals with those who've hurt you, He doesn't always punish with external consequences. Sometimes the heaviest judgment is internal. Sometimes the silence that falls on their life is filled with echoes of the truth they tried to deny. And that is where real change begins. Not with embarrassment, but with awareness. Not with exposure, but with awakening. When they can no longer pretend they were right. When they can no longer justify the damage. That's when you'll know God's hand is moving. It might take weeks. It might take years. But when their conscience awakens, you'll know. You'll feel the shift. Even if they never say a word. They might distance themselves from certain people. They might avoid places that remind them of you. They might go quiet, not out of peace, but because they're finally hearing what they've been running from. It's not your job to be their conscience. That's God's role. And when He steps in, He does it without force, but with precision. He breaks through pride like a whisper in the dark, a thought that won't go away, a memory they can't shake, a realization they can't ignore. And what's most beautiful is this: while their conscience is awakening, yours is resting. While they're beginning to feel the weight of what they did, you're beginning to feel the freedom of what you've released. You're not haunted by the past anymore. You've laid it down. They'll replay moments they thought they forgot. Words they said in anger echo back with different weight. Things they justified before begin to feel unjustifiable. What they convinced themselves was your fault, they start to see it differently now. But it doesn't happen because you argued with them. It doesn't happen because you finally got your point across. It happens because God reached into the part of them you could never touch, their heart, and lit a fire that can't be put out. That's when they start feeling convicted, not condemned. And there's a difference. Condemnation pushes someone into shame, but conviction draws them toward truth. And truth, when it's undeniable, is uncomfortable. God doesn't always send storms to bring people to their senses. Sometimes He simply removes the noise around them long enough for them to hear their own heart speak honestly. One of the clearest and most sobering signs that God is dealing with someone who hurt you is when their conscience starts to speak louder than their pride. You may never see it on the surface. They may not text you, call you, or ever admit what they did. But deep within, something starts to change. The voice they tried to silence, the one that whispered, "You were wrong for that," starts to grow louder. And that voice, that's not guilt alone. That's God. God has a way of awakening the part of a person they worked so hard to bury. See, it's easy for someone to pretend they're fine after hurting you. They can laugh, they can move on, they can distract themselves with new relationships, new routines, even new versions of themselves. But no matter how much they try to move on, they can't escape their own soul. And when God starts to stir their conscience, it becomes inescapable. If you're eating at a table they try to keep you from, and you're not gloating, you're grateful. That's elevation. That's maturity. That's what happens when God lifts you. He does it in a way that leaves no question about who was behind it. So when people try to block you, let them. When they talk behind your back, stay silent. When they try to hold you down, stay humble. Because the day is coming when God will prepare that table, and they'll be there, not to celebrate you, but to witness what He did in spite of them. And you'll be sitting at that table, not to prove them wrong, but to praise the one who made it all right. And there's something powerful about how God times it. He lets your enemies live long enough to see your fruit, not because He's cruel, but because He wants them to know that no matter what they tried, it didn't work. He wants them to understand that they were never in control, that their influence had a limit, that the one they underestimated, disrespected, and overlooked was actually the one He chose all along. And here's what's even more powerful. When you get to that table, you'll realize you're not even angry anymore. You don't want revenge. You don't need an apology. You've grown. You've healed. You see, when God prepares a table before you in the presence of your enemies, it's not about you gloating. It's not about you standing up and saying, "Look at me now." It's about God showing them who was with you the entire time. It's about Him saying, "You tried to write them off, but I wrote their story." It's about displaying His faithfulness, not just to bless you, but to reveal that He was working even when no one else believed in you. Elevation from God is not based on manipulation, control, or public approval. It's based on purity, endurance, and obedience. You didn't play the game they played. You didn't throw dirt. You didn't step on others to rise. And because of that, your rise is different. It's stable. It's holy. It's protected. There's something deeply humbling and profoundly spiritual about watching God elevate you in front of the very people who tried to tear you down. Not because you wanted revenge, not because you needed to prove a point, but because God saw everything they did to try and block you. And instead of fighting back, you stayed faithful. You kept your hands clean. And in return, He raised you up. It doesn't always look like a dramatic moment or a public scene. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's quiet. You begin to walk into rooms you once prayed for, and the people who doubted you are there, watching. The same ones who said you weren't ready, weren't good enough, weren't worthy, now have to sit and witness what God is doing in your life. They don't get to stop it. They don't even get a say, because what God has ordained, no opinion can. We cannot opinion anyone can, can't, cannot, 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 cannot. In the season where they say, God won't let the one who did the wounding grow, while the one who was wounded is still bleeding. That's not how His justice works. He begins to reverse the story. The one who was broken is now being rebuilt. The one who was silent is now being strengthened. The one who was overlooked is now being elevated. Not because they fought for it, but because they chose healing over hate. They chose peace over payback. And that healing begins to shine in ways no one can deny. You walk into a room and don't shrink anymore. You hear their name and it doesn't trigger you anymore. You speak about what happened with wisdom, not bitterness. That is evidence of a divine exchange. God took your pain, and in return, He gave you peace. And while you're stepping into your future, they're still repeating the past. And while you're healing, something strange starts to happen on the other side. The person who caused the pain, who may have once seemed so confident, in control, untouchable, starts to look stuck. They keep cycling through the same drama. They repeat the same habits. They seem frozen in a version of life that isn't growing. You look back and you realize they're still in the same place they were when they hurt you. Only now, you're not there anymore. That's not coincidence. That's God. He's moving you forward while they remain bound by what they refuse to own. Because make no mistake, when you hurt someone and refuse to repent, refuse to reflect, refuse to let God work on your heart, you end up trapped in your own mess. You stay stuck in the same patterns. You wear the same mask. You build walls to protect yourself from conviction. That's a prison. But when you surrender your pain to God, you don't just recover. You're released. One of the most powerful signs that God is dealing with those who hurt you is when you start to heal and they don't. When someone wounds you deeply, it can feel like they walk away untouched, unbothered, even blessed, while you're left with the emotional aftermath. But healing, real healing, is spiritual. It's something only God can initiate. And when He begins it in you, it's more than just recovery. It's rest, and that's when the reversal begins. You find yourself thinking about what happened less often. The sting in your chest starts to fade. You stop rehearsing the pain in your mind. Slowly, and sometimes without even noticing it first, you begin to breathe differently, laugh differently, walk differently. You start to see yourself again, not the version of you that was hurt, but the version that God always saw beneath the scars. The ones who spoke the loudest often become the ones left unheard. The ones who thought they held the power start to realize that without God's hand behind them, they were never truly in control. It's humbling to watch. And it should remind you, you never have to fight dirty to be protected. When someone uses their influence to wound, to isolate, or to control you, the greatest thing you can do is remain silent, stay pure, and keep walking. Because eventually, their voice will fade and yours will rise. Not because you shouted, but because God gave you the microphone. And sometimes it's not even a matter of dramatic exposure. It's something deeper. People just begin to lose interest in the drama. Their followers become tired. Their words start to sound empty. Their attempts to stir division fall flat. It's not that people suddenly become saints. It's that God redirects attention. He causes the influence they once had to evaporate. Not because of a scandal, not because of a fight, but because of a shift that only heaven can orchestrate. God knows how to protect your name without you having to defend it. He knows how to silence your enemies without you lifting a finger. And when He moves, it becomes painfully obvious who was driven by truth and who was driven by control. Conversations shift. Trust weakens. God begins to dismantle the platform they built on deception, manipulation, or ego. They don't see it coming. They think they still have the power to pull strings, to control the story. But God has a way of turning the volume down on those who use their voice to hurt His children. When someone misuses their influence to damage another person's spirit, especially someone who is walking with integrity, God doesn't just deal with the situation. He deals with the source. He silences the noise, not by shouting over it, but by making people stop listening altogether. Influence can be a dangerous thing when it's in the hands of the wrong person. Some people don't just hurt you in private, they try to ruin your reputation in public. They use their voice, their circle, and sometimes even your past to twist the narrative. They speak with confidence as if they know your heart better than you do. They gather people to their side, spread doubt about your character, and try to poison the atmosphere around your name. But what they always forget, is that God has the final say. And when He steps in, He starts to strip that influence away. It doesn't happen with a loud crash. It begins slowly, quietly. Their words start to lose weight. The people who once clung to every opinion they offered now start to question what they're really about. The spotlight they craved begins to dim, and the room they once controlled no longer responds the same. But to position you so that when the plan starts to unravel, you'll know it was never in your hands and it was never in theirs. It was in His all along. And the beauty of it is this: you don't have to announce it. You don't have to expose anybody. You don't have to try to fix what they broke. God lets their plans fail in a way that is both subtle and undeniable. People start to notice. Things stop working. Doors close. Efforts stall. All while He's lifting you up in the background. That's how God works. Quiet power. Sovereign reversal. Complete control. They meant to bury you, but God used the dirt to plant you. And when the fruit starts growing, when the blessings start blooming, those same people who tried to destroy you will have no choice but to witness it. You see, what people mean for evil, God has a way of flipping. He takes the very tools they use to try and destroy you and turns them into tools to build you up. That backstab that was meant to break you, it turns out to be the thing that launched you into healing. That lie that was told to discredit you, it exposed who they really are. That betrayal that made you question your worth, it ended up revealing your strength. Over and over again, God takes what was meant to derail your purpose and instead uses it to drive you deeper into your destiny. The plans that were designed to trap you end up backfiring. They become the same traps your enemies fall into. Their strategy begins to collapse under the weight of its own deception. It's not because you fought back. It's because God stepped in. He saw the whole thing from beginning to end. He allowed it to happen, not to break you. Sometimes the people who hurt you don't stop with the initial wound. They scheme, they plot, they make moves behind your back trying to control the outcome of your life. They spread rumors, manipulate situations, shut doors, or quietly celebrate when you stumble. But one of the most undeniable signs that God is dealing with them is this: their plans begin to fail. It may not happen all at once. In fact, it often begins slowly. Things they used to succeed at without even trying suddenly start falling apart. The influence they once had no longer opens the same doors. The words they used to twist people against you, those words fall flat now. People don't buy the act anymore. Situations they thought they controlled begin to spin out of their hands. It's not coincidence. It's divine interference. That's not guilt. They may not even feel guilty yet. It's spiritual unrest. It's that uneasy feeling in the pit of their stomach, a restlessness that follows them into the night and wakes them in the morning. That's the Spirit of God quietly knocking, not for vengeance, but for justice. God doesn't need to expose someone publicly to begin dealing with them. Often He starts in the place they can't hide from, their own soul. They begin to question things they never used to. The confidence they had when they lied on you, manipulated you, or betrayed you, it starts to shake. Their mind becomes unsettled, their decisions confused, their nights sleepless. And they may not even connect it to what they did to you, but it is connected. God is not mocked. When you sow hurt into another person's life, especially one of His children, you eventually reap disruption. There comes a moment in life when you're hurt so deeply that it shakes your trust, not just in people, but sometimes in the fairness of life itself. You sit there thinking, how could they do this and get away with it? But I want to tell you something that many overlook. When God begins to deal with someone who has hurt you, one of the first and clearest signs is that their peace gets disturbed. I'm not talking about visible punishment. No lightning strikes, no headlines, no dramatic karma. I mean something more personal, more internal, more inescapable. God begins His work with something people can't fake: the loss of peace.